Hello everybody, it's Chris Candler here. Hope you've been enjoying the FAQ series so far. We've been looking every day at a different story from the Bible that might help us through these difficult days. And because today's Mother's Day in many parts of the world, we're thinking particularly about one character who had a very difficult and very bittersweet life. Maybe today has been bittersweet for you. I know for many people Mother's Day is a particularly difficult day. Because it reminds us of, for some of us, that we haven't been able to have children, or that we had a difficult relationship with our mothers. And today, because of the lockdown, many people are not able to be with their mothers. And so that's particularly hard for many people around the world. And so friends of mine went to visit their mother but didn't go inside the house, made her a lovely display in the garden, put a Mother's Day card on her window, just so they were trying to reach out to her and let her know that she really mattered to them. Or maybe, like me, your mother has passed away and my dad's now on his own and we couldn't visit him to celebrate this day, and that's a particularly tough thing to experience as well. So I wonder whether this story today might particularly help you. It's someone that's not that well known in the Bible actually. Her name is Naomi. You might have come across her if you're familiar with the story of Ruth. But Naomi is set during a really difficult period in the history of Israel. Naomi lived in a time when Israel was continually being invaded by other nations. There was a sense of kind of national anxiety because there seems to be a cycle that they would get invaded and then they'd turn back to God, and then things would go well for a little while, and then they'd rebel against God, and then they'd get invaded again and again and again. And in the middle of this kind of repeating pattern of God's rescue and the nation of Israel's rebellion, you get this amazingly beautiful story called the Book of Ruth. And it starts off pretty okay. You know, there's a family. There's Naomi and her husband Elimelech, and they're living happily. And then there is a famine in the land of Bethlehem. And Bethlehem should ring a few bells for you if you're familiar with the Christmas story. Bethlehem was where Jesus was born. And the reason Jesus was born in Bethlehem is because Jesus was from the line of King David, and Bethlehem was David's city. So the fact they've kind of name dropped Bethlehem in this story is a little marker that someone important is going to be born here. It's a little bit like someone name dropping Gotham City or the planet Kryptonite. It's telling you the backstory for a superhero. And so this story of Ruth is going to be the backstory for King David. But we don't know that at the beginning of the story. We just have a little hint of it right there, why the story that Bethlehem is in famine. And that's a bit ironic because Bethlehem means house of bread. And maybe that's to talk about God's provision in history, that it was normally a place that could be relied upon for everything that you would need. But even Bethlehem, the house of bread, is in trouble. And so Naomi and her husband Elimelech and their two sons, Kilian and Mahlon, leave Israel and go to Moab. And that's a big deal because in the history of these two nations, Israel and Moab, just like near neighbours, often have a bit of tension. Sadly, England and France often has a bit of tension between us, but this was a little bit more extreme. The Moabites and the Israelites really hated each other. But never mind, maybe it's because there's a kind of common humanity being experienced in famine. But they leave. Naomi and her two sons and her husband leaves Israel. Something goes wrong. It seems that all the men in the story get wiped out. And Elimelech, Mahlon and Kilian all die. But by this time they have wives. One wife is called Ruth and the other is called Orpah. And you're just left with these three widows in the middle of Moab. And Naomi decides it's time for her to go home. There's nothing that's keeping her in Moab. Maybe things have got better back in Bethlehem and she's going to leave. But her two daughter-in-laws feel somehow responsible for her, maybe as an older, vulnerable woman. And so they agree to travel with her. And Naomi manages to convince Orpah to go home. But Ruth is absolutely convinced that she's going to stick with Naomi. And that's why I wanted to pick up the story right now. If you follow along in the Bible, it's Ruth chapter 1. And you get this incredible little piece here, verse 11. But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." There's that word bitter. That's going to turn up in a minute. At this they wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people and your God, my God. When you die, I will die. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. This is a beautiful picture, and it's really significant in the whole big picture of what happens in the rest of the Bible. And it's not marked by a landmark. It's somewhere on a dusty trail between Moab and Bethlehem, and there are no cameras. This is not on anyone's Twitter feed. This is just a personal, private encounter, and yet here it is. It's just absolutely amazing that Ruth, this Moabite woman, an enemy of the Israelites, clings to her mother-in-law and offers her solidarity. And for me, this is an important idea, that faith knows no geographical boundaries. We're living in really interesting times because of the coronavirus. Some presidents in parts of the world are saying this is a Chinese virus. We're almost like using it as a kind of political tool to tear apart our nations one from another. But in other parts of the world, we're saying actually we need each other. We need to learn from what happened in China or in Italy or in Spain, and there needs to be a global collective effort. It's interesting, as there's been a kind of massive rise in populist nationalism. We're all kind of battening down the hatches and closing our borders. We've got this kind of paradox going on. There's more xenophobia and fear of the other going on as we want to protect our little families from everyone else. But there's also a greater need for global cooperation and partnership. And for me, as a Christian, as someone trying to follow what the Bible has to say, I need to learn something here from the story of Ruth. That God's love and grace extends to both Ruth, a Moabitess, and Naomi, an Israelite. And in the kingdom of God, God doesn't respect those national barriers. He offers his love and mercy to everyone. Maybe you know about another dusty road, the one between Jerusalem and Jericho. And on that road was a Jewish man was attacked. And do you remember the story? There were two people that walked past him. One was a priest and the other was a Levite, and the third person that comes down the road is a Samaritan. And Jesus told that story about the Samaritan who tends the wounds of the man by the side of the road, the Jewish man by the side of the road, to demonstrate that in the kingdom of God, love for our neighbour is not just for those who are in our kind of genealogical gene pool, but it knows no boundaries. Love will cross any boundary necessary, because that's the response of faith to a God who loves the whole world. And in this story of Ruth and Naomi, you see that. Now, when they end up going back, there's still some trouble going on, because here, look what happens next in the story. Verse 19. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" I don't know how long she'd gone for, maybe long enough for her boys to grow up and marry, but she's gone long enough, but she's unrecognizable to a small village. Just two people turning up in a village sets the whole village ablaze, and yet they don't recognize her. And now, as Naomi enters this village, this is what she says: "Don't call me Naomi," she told me. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter." There's that word again. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. The word Naomi means pleasant or sweet. But things have been so bad for her that she now wants to rebrand herself. These incidents have affected her entire identity. And so now she wants a new name, Mara, which means bitter. And for me, I think this current crisis could bring bitterness into our lives. Maybe you've already tasted it. Maybe there are events that you're missing. A friend of mine was on the phone this afternoon because her wedding is being cancelled. She'd been waiting for so long to get married, finally meets the right guy, and now she can't have a celebration with all her friends and family. And that's a challenge, isn't it? All the deposits paid on various places where she was going to have her reception, and the vehicles and the food and all of that is up in the air. Others of us are in financial worry. There's danger about whether we're going to have a job to go back to at the end of this virus. Others are just wondering just how long this is going to last, and the pressure cooker that's on our families right now could bring bitterness out of us. So how do we find trust and faith in God when life tastes bitter? That's what I want us to pick up from the story of Naomi, or Mara as she now wants to be called in this moment. Even in this time of trouble, somehow Naomi is keeping on trusting in God. I don't know if you noticed that. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. It's interesting, isn't it? Naomi blames God for what's happened. She can see God's hand at work in this terrible moment, and it's causing her great distress, but still she can't deny that God is there. That's still part of her framework, still part of her mindset. And I wonder if that's a lesson. Are we only willing to receive good gifts from God, or are we also willing to receive the tough things from God too? The tragedy and disaster, can we even keep trusting God in the middle of that? Now, what's interesting is that she's very open that this is causing her great distress, and that's why she wants to rebrand who she is. But that tension, that paradox that God is in charge and yet terrible things have happened to me, that is the fight of faith that every believer goes through. I don't know a believer that isn't wrestling with the idea of God's control of the universe, his faithfulness, his goodness in the light of something as terrible as this pandemic. And if you are wrestling with that, you're in good company. The Bible's full of people that wrestle with God in this way. Some people would see Naomi as a female version of Job, who's another person who wrestles with the apparent absence of God, or the curse of God. And so hold on, you are not alone. This is not an unusual experience, and it's okay to be wrestling. We talked a little bit about that when we looked at Jacob the other day. Anyway, the story goes on. Ruth and Naomi come back to Bethlehem. They've come just in time for the barley harvest, and it just so happens that they end up working in the field. Well, Ruth goes out and works in the field of a man named Boaz, who's a really upstanding guy. His greeting to his workers is, "The Lord be with you." And when Ruth turns up to glean, he's very happy to accommodate her. Now, gleaning was a really interesting idea in the Old Testament. If you were a farmer or a landowner, you might have many people that worked for you, but if someone was poor and in need, they were to be allowed to come in, and after your harvesters had been through a field, they were allowed to come and pick up the bits that were left behind. In other words, as you harvested, you weren't supposed to be so intensive that there was nothing left. You were supposed to leave some for poor people to be able to pick up. And interestingly, the poor people weren't supposed to just sit at home and then receive an aid package. They were supposed to be brought close enough to work alongside these workers. There was proximity involved, and there was dignity, because they were allowed to work for themselves. They didn't have enough money to own land, but they were supposed to be welcome to work alongside your workers. And here's a lovely little picture maybe of for your next shopping trip. You could go and clear out the shelves, buy everything you need, fill your baskets, or you could take the gleaning principle to be mindful of those that don't have access to what you and I have access to make sure there's enough left for others to come and collect. Or even contributing to the food bank. This crisis seems to bring out the worst in people, but also the best in people. I think my Twitter feed has been equally full of people that are showing empty shelves, or I read today of a NHS worker, I think it was a paramedic, who just come back from an 18-hour shift to find out that he was going to be evicted by his landlady, who was nervous about contracting the virus. And of course, the Twitter feed was full of people going, no, I'm a lawyer, I'll fight your case, you can't be evicted under these circumstances. Other people were saying that person could come and stay with them, or their son had left a spare room in a building that he could use, or a hotel manager offering to make space. So this virus, this pandemic, is bringing out the worst in people and the best in people. And here in this time of tragedy in Ruth's and Naomi's life, it's bringing out the worst in people and the best in people. Anyway, long story short, Boaz ends up marrying Ruth, and they end up having a child together. And for me, that's fascinating. It turns out that Boaz was the rightful redeemer. It's a kind of legal position that if Naomi was widowed, then someone ought to marry someone in the family to provide that widow an heir. And Boaz was one of those in line to play that role, so that the family wouldn't be left without a legacy, without a future, without a hope. And it just so happened that Ruth had been gleaning in his field at just the right time. That had all come to play. And so it's interesting, isn't it, that when you come to the end of this little story, Boaz and Ruth are married, they have a child together, and then the whole place bursts into song. Have a look at verse 13 of chapter 4 if you're following along. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. Then he went to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. I'm going to pick up on the genealogy in a minute. But this is a fascinating story because, what started off with disaster in the chapter 1, with Naomi wanting to be rebranded as Mara, has now kind of turned full circle. And Faith has somehow, her continued trust in God and God's provision for her has turned things around. And she hasn't got her husband back, and she hasn't got her sons back, but she's been given this 7 Israelite sons. That's a massive sign of inclusion, both on a gender basis and on a nationality and ethnicity basis. And it's interesting that the child is described as Naomi's, even though Ruth has borne him. Now that could just be because they're thinking about land inheritance rights and how the future legacy will be kind of worked out. Or it could be, as in many cultures, Boaz and Ruth might have decided to allow Naomi to adopt this child so that he would be with her, she would raise him. We're not quite sure how these things land. But you see, Naomi described herself as being emptied by God. And now she can join in this celebration and praise that God has filled her up and made her life worth living again. God has turned things around for her. Now, I want to be careful here. We're not promising that if you just trust in God more and trust in God enough, then whatever you've lost will always be restored to you. We're not saying that, but in this story, we can see the kind of hand of God at work as we look back. It's interesting, there are no kind of prophetic voices in the story. There's no angels, no visitations, no words from God. God is kind of somehow in the background. and we might not be able to recognize him in the details of this story because he doesn't really turn up. But he turns up in the same way that a director might turn up in most films. Not, I don't mean like Alfred Hitchcock, who always used to kind of write a part for himself so he could actually literally be in the film. No, every director is in the film that they make, but normally that's invisibly so. Just by organising events, by setting up scenes, by narrating the story, their fingerprints are everywhere, even if you physically can't see them. And that's true in this story of Naomi and Ruth, isn't it? That God has been faithful to Naomi, even in the dark times, by giving her this incredible daughter-in-law who will walk with her through thick and thin, even though she's from the wrong race, by setting up the whole plot that she would be, that Ruth would be gleaning in Boaz's field, and Boaz is the upstanding kind of man that would make that possible, and that God would kind of knit the circumstances of their lives together so that they would meet and fall in love and a baby would be provided. God has been orchestrating things. He's like the grand chess master, making things work out. And that becomes really clear when you read the next part of this story. Now, I'm not normally a big fan of genealogies. My dad kind of tried to trace ours. We do an annual book where all the different relatives have to put all their names and the family tree. Not normally my thing, but here, look at this genealogy. The women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. This then is the family line of Perez. So what's going on? David, the superhero that was mentioned in the opening, or alluded to in the opening verses, Bethlehem and David are synonymous, just like Gotham City and Batman, Kryptonite and Superman. So we knew something important was going on, but we didn't necessarily know that this Moabite woman, this enemy woman, would end up becoming, the grandmother of David, the greatest king Israel has ever known. And David will be a forerunner for Jesus, the greatest hero the world has ever known, the true redeemer that's able to rescue and turn situations upside down, things that start off bad ending up for the good. Jesus, the one who turns the pain and suffering of the world on the cross into the moment that the love of God is most clearly revealed. The story of Ruth and Naomi and Boaz, of sweetness and bitterness and bitterness and sweetness, all are just a foretaste of what's going to happen with Jesus, the one who can turn around any circumstance, the one that can make the calm come out of the storm. He can heal, he can make the leper clean, he can heal the sick, he can raise the dead. And you see that in little microcosm here in this story of Naomi, Ruth and Boaz. This story is very precious to me. I love it. I love teaching on it, and you've had a shortened version of it tonight. If you want a longer version of it, here's a book. This is a book I wrote called God Is... Oh, if I hide my face, is the camera going to find it? It's called God Is Stranger. And it kind of looks at some of the difficult passages of the Bible and how they help us to meet God in difficult circumstances. It is available in all good bookshops, even though most of them are closed, and definitely it's available as an Amazon Kindle book. But in the chapter I wrote on Naomi and Ruth, I likened the story to that of probably one of my favourite box sets ever. It's called Breaking Bad. And Breaking Bad starts with Walter White, a mild-mannered chemistry teacher, talking to a class of students, and he says, a lot of people think chemistry is the study of matter, but I like to see it as the study of change. And what you see in the life of Walter White is he has calamity after calamity after calamity, and it changes him from this mild-mannered teacher into Heisenberg, a drug kingpin. It's a complete transformation. You see change happening in Walter White's life. And what happens when bad things collide with good people? What happens? Well, in Walter White, it just leads to a complete disintegration. I won't spoil it for you. It's a great book set to watch, not with children. It's got some really adult themes, but massively big plot line, really worth watching. But for Ruth and Naomi, that transformation, even though they are hit by the same level of calamity, leads to a very radical transformation. We saw Naomi, sweetness, moves to Mara, bitterness, but she's back again at the end because God has sustained her. He's lifted her up out of her disaster, out of her pain, and out of the pit of her despair. And my prayer for you as you're going through this pandemic, this bittersweet day of Mother's Day, is maybe to draw some comfort from Mother Naomi, and how even in difficult circumstances she holds on to God, and that holding on proves good for her and good for God. Her story is marked as a story of faithfulness in spite of disaster, and God in the end comes through for her, and in one way or another God will come through for us. Whether that provision is in this life or in the next life, we can hold on because God is good all the time. Thanks so much for listening. I'm really up for taking advice and input about how to make this series better. We'll be back again tomorrow at 7:45 as usual, and we'll be looking at a brand new story then. I'm hoping these stories will get under your skin and really help you to grow faith in challenging times. Let me know how you get on. Talk to you soon. Bye.